Welcome to a public forum. I'm your host, Scott Wheeler. Today's guest is Jennifer Barrett, the Deputy State's Attorney for Bennington County. Welcome to the show, Jennifer.
Hi, Scott. Thanks for having me.
So what brings you up to this neck of the woods? You're about as far away from home as you can get.
That's right. I love Orleans County. I worked up here. I started my law career up here in Alan Franklin's office as a clerk.
Right.
I was hired as a Deputy State's Attorney. I stayed up here. It was a part-time position, so I left to go and take a full-time position to pay for my student loans. But I want to come back. I love it up here. I have family up here, and this is where I want to start a family.
So if you'd been full-time, would you have stayed here?
Absolutely.
Right. Now, what do you like about the Northeast Kingdom?
It's beautiful. It's a place like nowhere else in Vermont. The people are genuine. The landscape is beautiful. There's lakes. It's just a place that's nowhere else.
Right. So you're running for state's attorney against, well, really for the seat that your former boss holds.
That's correct.
Right. How does that feel to know that you're running against your former boss?
Scott, that's an interesting question. It's not personal. I like Alan. I like him as a person. But it's a job that I'm ready to take on, and I think that I can affect a positive change.
Right. So how are you campaigning? You're down there. You've got to come way up here. What is that? A three-hour trip?
It is. I've been up here every weekend since I started my campaign. I've been out meeting the people in the community, knocking on doors, introducing myself to business owners, and making connections. And I will continue to do that throughout the campaign, and anytime I can get up here. I was up here all week this week. I'll be up here showing my face and making myself available.
So let's back up now. Who are you? You know, I know you're the Deputy State's Attorney for Bennington County, but let's hear a little bit about who you are.
I'm a Vermonter, born and raised in Brattleboro. My family's from Brattleboro. My family comes from a career of public service. My dad is the Director of Public Works, and he was a firefighter for 30 years. So that's really a calling that I took on, the public service. I was born and raised in Brattleboro. I went to college in Burlington. I have a degree in computer and digital forensics. And then I went to law school in New Hampshire. And then I've been back, and I started my law career in the Windham County State's Attorney's Office. And then my first paid job was the Orleans County State's Attorney's Office.
How did you like Orleans? How did you like the court as a whole up here?
I liked it. It was an interesting system. I think the defense attorneys and the prosecutors work well together. There's enough cases that it poses a challenge, but it's a little bit, there's less cases than there is in the bigger counties, so you can spend more time with some of the cases.
So if you're elected, because you have to go through a primary process first, right?
I do, assuming that Alan Franklin runs as a Republican, then there will be a primary process. I'm running as a Republican. Right now, the other candidates, there's one who's independent and one who's a Democrat, and it's assumed that Alan will be running as a Republican, so if he does, there will be a primary election.
You know, tell me, why is this a political race? I understand the House, I understand the Senate, those are political races. When it comes to the law, I have a hard time conceptualizing why it's political. Why did you have to declare a party?
It's a great question, Scott. It's not political in the sense of party lines.
Right.
It doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat. It's that you're going to advocate for justice and do the job effectively. It shouldn't matter what party someone runs for.
But is this a constitutional thing? Is that the reason you have to declare a party?
Well, the Constitution requires that there be a campaign, and all elections require a party.
Right. So what is your strong point? If you had to say what your strong points were, what are they?
I'm a trial attorney. I do a lot of trials, and I'm experienced in trials. I focus my energy right now on the domestic violence caseload, and so mostly felonies, crimes of violence involving serious bodily injury. I have some with gunshots and stab wounds, and I advocate for victims of domestic violence through the prosecution. And so that is what I am passionate about, one of the most passionate things.
Do you have more serious crimes down in Bennington County since you are closer to urban centers?
I think Yes. The long and the short answer is yes, there are significantly more violent crimes and more drug offenses and other offenses in Bennington County. But I don't know. I haven't looked at per capita what that would mean.
Right, because I know we have if I recall right, we do have a number of cases, serious cases, including I think a couple murder cases that are coming up in Orleans County, including one that occurred out in Westfield. So it seems to me like the Northeast Kingdom, we used to live in a world of rose-colored, we used to look at the world through rose-colored glasses, where nothing really went wrong here too seriously in the way of murder. But it seems like that is starting to change. Down in Caledonia County, we had that horrible murder involving the school teacher. Then over in Sheffield, we had a very well-respected senior citizen who was murdered. And it seems like even the face of murder is changing. Do you think have you ever prosecuted a murder case?
I haven't, but I have helped with attempted murder cases. Alan Franklin actually had recruited me to come back up here to help him try an attempted murder case. It ended up resolving before trial, but I've been involved in cases that are to the level of an attempted murder.
Right. Now, when you are a prosecutor, what is the role? What does the role consist of? Is it you're fighting for the state, but what is your role?
It's not just fighting for the state. It's fighting for what justice is, and that can mean a number of different things depending on the case. So if you start with somebody who's never had an interaction with the law and they make a bad decision and they come in, justice for them is something different than justice from somebody who's been committing crimes for 30 years and they're a violent offender. So our job is to figure out what's fair and what's justice, what will make the community whole, what will deter this person from being engaged in the criminal justice system again, what's an appropriate punishment. It's all different. It's deciding based on the person, the facts of the case, what's fair, what is going to best serve the community with this offense to make the community whole again.
Right. So if I have never even had a speeding ticket.
Yeah.
The only time I ever had a parking ticket was when Governor Douglas kept me in a meeting too long, and I got a parking ticket down on State Street. So I hardly think that's enough to have me go to court. But if I showed up to court on a relatively minor thing, not domestic or anything like that, a property crime, would you treat me different than, say, the guy who showed up in your courthouse, say, after the 5th time of pulling the same thing?
Absolutely. I think that somebody who has spent a number of years in the community and not engaged in the criminal system deserves a different punishment than somebody who's a frequent flyer to the courthouse. Right. So if you came in, it's the first time you went down to the store, you stole something. It's the first time ever. You otherwise have no record. Likely that'd be a case that would go to diversion. Right. Assuming it's nothing egregious and you maybe stole a candy bar or something else. And a diversion would be an appropriate sentence. Diversion is where you can earn it so it doesn't go on your record. You meet with a community-based board. They determine an appropriate punishment. It could be an essay. It could be some research, an apology to the victims, paying them back. And then if you complete what they ask of you, then it goes off your record entirely. So if you came in, first-time offender, nothing egregious, a small property crime, diversion would be appropriate. Diversion wouldn't be appropriate for somebody who has 5 convictions.
Right. I was going to ask you about diversion and other programs where you actually work to make societal, amends. Are you a believer in those?
Absolutely. I think they have their role. The restorative justice programs work well for low-level, nonviolent misdemeanors and people who don't have a lot of experience committing crimes. So somebody who doesn't have an extensive record. But like the restorative justice, the reparative board, people go in and it can be done as part of a sentence. So if someone's on probation, it could be a condition of probation, or it could be the straight sentence, reparative board. You'd still have a conviction, so that's the difference from diversion. But you'd meet with a panel of community members. The victim would have an opportunity to have input, and as a group, you would decide what is going to make the community whole here, what's appropriate. And so it could be, again, a letter of apology, an essay, some research. Maybe they ask you to go do some counseling. Maybe there's an alcohol problem. All of those things can be addressed as the community. And it benefits the community because then the community is involved in deciding the outcome for low-level offenses.
We currently have a shortage of prison space. So who belongs in prison? Because, you know, I've read there's been some instances, I know like poaching is against the law. You should not be poaching, but for some reason I have a hard time conceptualizing using prison space for somebody who shot a deer out of season when I believe there's other ways that you can make that person's life a little miserable too. Who belongs in prison?
The people who belong in prison are violent offenders, so serious domestic abusers or otherwise violent offenders, and the people bringing drugs into our community. Those are the people who need to go to jail. There's other reasons where someone could have an extensive record, where a jail sentence could be appropriate with burglaries and other serious felonies, but in general, it's the people who are violent, it's the people who are bringing drugs into the community that need to be in jail.
Right. What in the news, there's a lot of talk about the number of people who are using and abusing prescription drugs and heroin. Do they belong? Do the users belong in jail, or is there some other method of helping them while also punishing them?
I'm going to take that back and start at the beginning. So there is an epidemic. There is a terrible drug epidemic, heroin epidemic, and prescription pill epidemic in Vermont and in the Northeast Kingdom. And we as a community need to address it head on. It needs to be addressed from every aspect, not just the criminal justice system. But we wouldn't benefit anyone if we locked up every addict. That's not going to suit the community, it's not going to suit the addict, and it's not going to achieve justice. The low-level people using heroin need to be rehabilitated. They need to go to rehab. They need to be on probation. They need to have furlough sentences so they can be supervised by the Department of Corrections strictly, have a curfew, all of those things so that we can address the addiction. Addicts going to jail without any programming are going to come out addicts. And so we need to address the addiction problem because as long as there's an addiction problem in our community, people are going to come into our community with drugs. That being said, the people who are bringing drugs into our community, the people coming from New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and driving drugs into our community, they need to go to jail.
Right.
They need to be incapacitated and they need to be punished.
Right. Now, when we talk about drugs, we usually talk about heroin and prescription drugs, but what about marijuana? Because that is a topic that whether everybody approves it or not, we are slowly becoming a more liberal society when it comes to marijuana. What is your stance?
The lawmakers have spoken on what the law will be in Vermont as to marijuana, and I will enforce it the way the state has decided appropriate, and that's just how it'll be.
So you don't make the laws, in other words. You don't get out of bed and say, all right, I'm going to say, well, no, there's zero tolerance for marijuana.
No, I will enforce the laws the way that they're written.
Right. And the other issue that it often stems around Newport, because Newport is the only city, per se, in the Northeast Kingdom, the only designated city. And in such, it also has some more urban issues. And they've been struggling recently with everywhere from, the methadone. They have a methadone program in town, which I don't know how it's working, but there's also now talk about having needle exchange. Now, I know that's a little bit out of your area, but do you have any feelings about community treatment, such as, needle exchange for users?
Well, specifically, the needle exchange is really a conflict for me too, because I see the pros and I see the cons of it. On the pros side, if there's a needle exchange, at least people won't be using dirty needles. People who are using heroin are contracting serious diseases and they have no place to bring their dirty needles and they have no place to get clean needles. That being said, we don't want to enable people to use drugs in the community. But I'm not sure what the balance is, but we can't as a community turn a blind eye entirely to the fact that people are using drugs in the community. If we don't look at it and we pretend it's not there, it's not going away. It's going to get worse. And so I don't know if a needle exchange is the answer, but I think community awareness and addressing rehabilitation and different counseling services in the community is the answer.
You know, from being a non-drug user, other than coffee, which is a mild drug, and then beer, which is also a drug. I don't use any forms of illegal drugs. I can't conceptualize, with all the education we now have and what you see in the news, what makes somebody want to stick a needle in their arm and shoot up heroin. I know that's there's other ways, but why?
The problem starts, and it's twofold. One, people are getting addicted to painkillers because of injuries. Painkillers are being overprescribed in all the communities. So somebody who gets in a bad car accident or breaks their leg or breaks their arm, they're being given pills and they're being given refills. And so people are becoming addicted that way. But that's not just it. But because some doctors are over-prescribing the painkillers, they're more prevalent in the community. So people are using them recreationally. And then the high is similar from the painkillers to the heroin. So when they can't afford the pills anymore, they're switching over to heroin. And at that point, they're already addicted. And they're not thinking the way you or I would of, wow, how could someone possibly put a needle in their arm? They're thinking in terms of a desperate addict who needs to get their high.
I've been fortunate to actually interview or talk to people who were addicted and they've recovered. And sometimes just talking to them, it's such an eye-opener, the little world they have, that there's so many users who are kind of connected, and to where they can even tell you which doctors to go to who will hand out which drugs, and which doctors who won't even give you an aspirin. And it's been fascinating talking to some of these folks who've had success stories. Well, success stories, do you see many of them where you've had hardened users who are given the tools to recover and have the motivation? Have you had anybody come back before you?
Well, there are people who we have thought have kicked the addiction and come back and have relapsed. That happens. But there are the people who are able to kick the addiction. But addiction, from what I understand from my job and talking to people with addiction, is a lifelong struggle. It's not over. You could relapse 20 years later. There are different things that could trigger someone into a relapse years and years and years later. So there are people who are successful for periods of times, and there's people who can address their addiction and not relapse, but it's a difficult and ongoing struggle.
Well, let's change over to your expertise is domestic violence.
It is.
How prevalent is it in Vermont?
It's prevalent. In the last few decades, it's come more out of the closet. Domestic violence is something that initially people didn't want to get involved with. It was dealt with behind closed doors. And only even more so in the last 10 years has it been something that we look at as a criminal justice system more. The juries are starting to understand and the public is starting to understand that there's a big problem.
Right. Now, I've talked to Keith Flynn about this because Keith and I go way back, and he's been on my shows. And let's be real, the majority of the people who are victims of domestic violence are women. But I know of cases personally where the man has been the victim and they don't feel comfortable, and I think it's a tough thing for a man to come forward. Do you see there's any issue, like, would you prosecute a male, female, male type of abuse the same way?
I do. I have cases where there are male victims and female abusers, and I treat all of the cases the same. Gender aside, a domestic abuser has a certain mentality, a method of control, and I'm talking actual domestic abusers. The statute covers roommates, father-daughter, types of situations. But when I talk about domestic violence, those are domestic violence. But when we're talking about actual domestic violence, the way you think about it traditionally, it doesn't matter what the gender is. It's somebody who uses mental and physical abuse to control the other person, and it's really a pattern of behavior. And so if there is a female abuser, she uses the same techniques to control and abuse her victim that a male abuser would use.
Right. Now, I hate to bring up this topic with you because I don't personally think it's an issue. But we're going to talk, you were talking about gender, and that is your age, and you're not, well, let's start with your age. There's going to be some people who are going to say, geez, she's probably too young to be a prosecutor. Mm-hmm. What's your response?
Scott, people are going to say that. It's obvious. If you put my picture with the other candidates, I'm 20 years younger than them. The community, when they look at my experience and my ability to be a leader, I think they'll be able to get beyond it.
Right. Then the other thing is, there might be some people who say, geez, we've got a couple candidates here. They were born and raised here, but you're from Brattleboro and you work in Bennington now. How do you respond to that?
It's true. I think that to some people that might be a disadvantage. But I'm born and raised in Vermont. I want to come back to Orleans County. There's not a lot of young professionals who want to come to Orleans County, and I want to be here. This is where I want to start my family. This is where I want to raise my children, and I will be back the second that I'm elected full time.
Right. And I personally don't see age as a factor whatsoever, because just because somebody's older doesn't make them better or wiser. So I hated to bring up that topic, but we talked about it before, that we knew that, you knew that would be one question that would come your way. Are you looking forward to taking over the position if you are elected?
Absolutely, Scott. I think that there is a lot of changes to be made. Orleans County is in a really interesting spot right now. There's a lot of expansion, and there's a lot of things going on in the community that's going to make the community grow. And in order for the community to effectively grow, which it's going to do, is we need to have an effective public safety team, and that will be me.
And the way I look at electing somebody, it isn't a popularity contest. It's too often is. What a lot of people do, and I hate to say this, is I've probably done this in the past, is name recognition. No, name recognition isn't the way to elect somebody. It's who's best for the job. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think that sometimes people do just recognize a name and that's how they vote, but I really encourage everybody who's watching to go out and learn about the candidates, learn about their qualifications, their experience, and figure out who they think the best candidate will be.
I see this as a very important race just for the health even of Orleans County. And we have some really good candidates running for this position. How do you stand above?
Scott, I stand above for a number of reasons, and this is what I will do for Orleans County if I am elected. I will address the opiate addiction. I will address it within the community. I will fight for tough jail sentences for people who are trafficking drugs and bringing drugs in the community. I will work for furlough and probationary sentences for the addicts. I will have a zero tolerance for violence involving children. Any cases that involve violence on a child, I will be looking for jail. I'll address domestic violence in the community. That's something that I'm passionate about. I will hold offenders accountable. I will work to have strong cases, evidence-based cases, and I will bring cases to trial. I won't dismiss a case because it's tough or it's complicated. If there was a crime that was committed in our community, I will bring it to the public, to a jury trial, to have them decide. I won't dismiss cases because they're not clear winners.
And as a prosecutor, you're not a one-person team. Don't you have to work? You have a team of your own, but then don't you have to work well with the attorneys, with probation and parole?
Absolutely. there needs to be a cohesive relationship with all the departments. You have to work well with law enforcement. You have to work well with probation. You have to work well with the judicial system and the defense attorneys. Ultimately, they're separate jobs and they're separate roles, and you're not always going to agree with the other departments.
Right.
But what's important is working together because we are all one big team.
Now, before the show, I actually read some articles about you, and it appears that you've gained quite a name recognition for yourself down in Bennington County. And how do you feel about leaving Bennington?
Bittersweet. I like Bennington, and I've had an amazing experience. I work with a strong female state's attorney down there who's given me a lot of skills and tools. She's also given me a lot of leeway to try my cases and deal with my cases the way I want to. So I've been able to do a lot of trials. I've done a lot of contested hearings. I've done a lot of court appearances that I wouldn't have gotten if I had stayed up here. I wouldn't have had those experiences. And so it's been great. I love what I do. I love prosecuting domestic violence, but I'm ready for something bigger and better.
You must have to be tough to be a prosecutor, though, because to tell you the truth is, I could never be a prosecutor. There's no doubt about it. But do you have to be tough?
Absolutely. You have to be somebody who's willing to stick to what you think is fair, and someone who's not going to back down because of a defense attorney, someone who's not going to back down if it's a case that's not politically, that people don't like in the public. You have to fight for justice, and you have to be willing to go up against people who aren't happy with you.
Right. Have you ever been prosecuting a case where you had second thoughts about the person's guilt?
No. Yes and no. There's been cases that have been filed where charges have been filed that later I've thought, okay, I don't think that this is a case that should go to a jury or should continue, and I've dismissed them. That's what happens. If there is a case that I either think that the person is not guilty or that I know that I absolutely could not prove, then a dismissal would be okay. I've never been in the middle of a jury trial and thought, I don't think this person is guilty. That has never happened to me, because at that point you've spent a significant amount of time with the case, interviewing the witnesses, having depositions, talking to the law enforcement, talking to the defense attorney. So once a case is at trial, it's a whole different ballgame than a case that had been filed initially.
Right. So you've been up here for, a few weeks now, getting out. What are you hearing from people when you introduce yourself?
People have been great. They've been really receptive to me. They've been kind, and it seems like the people of Orleans County are looking for a change too.
Have you talked to any members of law enforcement?
I have. I've talked to a number of members of law enforcement. Chief DeSanto is endorsing me publicly, and a number of the other law enforcement agencies are helping me and supporting me.
And as we discussed before, you're not really running against anybody. You're running on who you are and your record.
Absolutely. I don't want a negative campaign. I want people to know me, and I want them to elect me because they want me to be their state's attorney.
Right. So we only have a few more minutes left. What do you have anything else you want the viewers to know about you?
I want the viewers to know that I will zealously advocate for justice on everybody's behalf. I won't work for any agency. I won't always support law enforcement. I will support them when they're right, but there's times where everybody's not perfect. I will be looking for justice. I will be supporting the victims. I will be advocating for victims. I will be advocating for the community at large. I want a cohesive justice for everybody. I will work for everybody.
Are you going to be... I think Keith Flynn had a way about him that he was a very public figure at the same time. Are you going to try to remain a high-profile person?
High profile, I don't know about that word, but I want to be involved in the community. I want to know everybody. I want to meet everybody. I want to be at the events, and that's something I will continue to do if I'm elected, is being in the public and being engaged in the things going on in the public.
If I were to call up down in Bennington, talk to law enforcement that you've dealt with, what do you think they would say about you?
I think they'd say that I'm no nonsense, that I will fight for them, but if someone came to me and they messed something up, I'm the first one to sit them down and say, this is not right, this is why you did not do this right, and this is how you need to do it next time. I think that they would consider me fair and consider me somebody who works well with them but is willing to tell them if something's not okay.
Right. So your primary is coming up on August 26th.
Yes.
And, well, that's if Alan runs as a Republican. And so to go on to the general election, you have to win the primary.
Absolutely. I do have to win the primary. So it's going to be important for the viewers and the public to get out and vote and have their say then, because only one Republican candidate can make it to the final election. So people have to get out in the primary if this is something that they care about to vote.
And primaries are tough because not so many people turn out. And no matter what race, when you have a primary, funny things happen in primaries. So people really need to get out and vote, whether it's for you or whether it's for Alan. It's really for the future. In many ways, it's for the future of Orleans County. How confident are you that you can survive the primary?
I'm confident. I am ready to serve Orleans County. I'm confident that I'll be elected in the primary.
And once you get through the primary, then you go into the general election a few weeks later, and that's going to, at this rate, that will what? There'll be 3 of you. There'll be a Democrat, a Republican, and at least 1 independent.
Assuming everybody files petitions as we anticipate.
Right. When is the filing?
This week.
This week.
Well, this coming week.
Have you filed?
Not yet. I have all my signatures. I just haven't brought it to the county clerk yet.
Right. And, all right, final words.
I want to encourage people to come out and vote, and if anybody wants to know anything about me between now and then, I encourage you to visit my Facebook page or to contact me in any way you can.
And how can somebody contact you?
You can contact me on Facebook. You can contact me by email, Barrett.for.Orleans@gmail.com, and I will be up here. I will be in the community. Stop me and find me.
Is this your first race?
It is.
How does it feel?
Good.
Oh, I'm glad it feels good because you got a few more weeks of this. And from a former legislator, myself, those are some long weeks you have ahead of you. And I'm sure you'll be doing a lot of door knocking, you'll do a lot of walking, and you'll be doing a lot of meeting and greeting.
I sure will. I'll be out there.
All right. Okay. Thank you for coming on the show, and hope things work out for the best for Orleans County.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you to the viewers for tuning in.